This is a Naruhina rant, because I support this pairing a lot, and it so happens to be my second 1-2 pairing in the Naruto series. Here I go. There are a lot of things I like about this pairing, and to be honest, I didn't ship Naruto with anybody until I saw Hinata. Their dynamic had something different about it compared to those are the dynamics that Naruto had with other characters. So that alone was enough to draw me into liking the pairing. Now, Hinata and Naruto have not exactly had very easy lives. Naruto grew up without even knowing what love was about, let alone family love, because he never knew his parents. They sacrificed their lives to save him. Unfortunately for him, his life would be plagued by hatred, something his parents would have not wished upon him. Hinata more or less had a very similar upbringing, even though she had a family and siblings and lots of relatives because she's part of this huge and noble and famous clan. She was alone. Even her little sister rejected her. Her father declared her as weak and inadequate and not worthy to hold the name of Hyuga, let alone the title of heiress of the clan. So instead, he chose to make her little sister, Hanabi, the heir. Or at least was intending to. This, of course, shattered Hinata's morale and her determination, wrecked her childhood. It had a great impact on her. Her self-confidence was low. Her self-esteem was rock bottom. And even though she worked hard, she always gave up. The determination wasn't there, because most likely she was afraid of the pain of failure once more. Most likely she was afraid of failing again. Naruto, on the other hand, his determination never wavered. The more people shunned him and ostracized him, the more determined he was to get them to notice him. Even though it made the hatred even worse, at least they were looking at him. Poor Hinata, nobody looked at her. Nobody in her family, that is. And because of her shrinking violet status in the class, I can very much imagine that nobody at the academy really talked to her either, because she was so small and shy and quiet. And Naruto was at the other end of the spectrum, loud, outgoing, extroverted. She was everything. He was everything that Hinata wished she could be. So it was no wonder that during their academy days she was always watching him. She not only felt sympathy for his plight, but she empathized with it, to some extent, because she too had been on the receiving end of hatred. Even though she had relatives, the way they treated her, it was the equivalent of not having a family at all, because she had no one to confide in, let alone anybody to help her. So it was no wonder that Naruto was to become her role model, and not only that, even more, as she matured and grew up. Naruto, because he suffered so much as a child, it was no wonder that he did not notice Hinata watching him, and that he did not know how she felt about him, how much she admired him and looked up to him as somebody positive. You see, even before anybody would spare him a glance, Hinata was the one who looked at him. She was the first one who truly looked at him. She saw him for what he was, not for the spirit that dwelled within him, but she saw him as a person, a human being. Everyone else saw him as a creature, an ugly manifestation of animosity and a threat. Everybody viewed him negatively, and with fear. They were all scared of him as well. Hinata was never scared of him, ever. Not once did she express fear towards him, and not even now. I think that's amazing, that Hinata was the first one to acknowledge Naruto, even though Naruto wasn't aware of it. Essentially, if you look at it, she's the first one who acknowledged him. Even though Iruka acknowledged Naruto, he's the first person that Naruto was aware of who had acknowledged him. It was only, of course, in Part 2, Shippuden, when Naruto was to learn that Hinata had loved him, that Hinata had acknowledged him too, but she had done so way before his teacher had ever, and way before his teacher. And another thing, Hinata's view of Naruto has always been positive. It has never, ever, ever been negative. Not from what I can recall from reading the manga. I mean, if I'm wrong, please feel free to correct me. But even Iruka, somewhere deep down, he feared him. And maybe it would pain him to admit it, but even though they got on and he was nice to Naruto, even deep down, I bet even then he still harbored some kind of hatred, fueled by the grief at the loss of his parents on the night the Kyuubi attacked. So I don't blame him. However, Iruka then thought, but Iruka acknowledged Naruto because they were both fellow orphans, and he knew what it was like. He knew what it was like to lose his parents, but he could only imagine what it was like not knowing them, not having had that love in the first place. You could say that's an even worse situation, and that is probably one of the reasons why Iruka acknowledged Naruto the way he did. However, Hinata's acknowledgement was different because, as I said before, she never saw him as a monster in the first place, whereas Iruka did. And so when everyone else stared at him and looked through him and saw the monster, she looked at him and saw the person that he could be and that he was. She saw only him. Of course, that admiration would soon turn into something much more. Now, Naruto's side of things, at least for me, Hinata, to him, he always thought she was weird and she was timid and shy and just odd and eccentric, and so he didn't really think much of her because he didn't know about her, and maybe he was slightly annoyed and frustrated, perhaps. But because he didn't really know her, I suppose there wasn't much on Naruto's end at that point. However, that all changed when the Chunin exams came around, because then us as readers saw more about Hinata. So it was then the Naruhina pairing really came into its element, at least for me. I knew she had a crush on him. It was just the way she acted around him, the shyness, the fainting, the blushing, the stuttering, the sheer nervousness of her demeanour whenever she was around Naruto implied to me that she might have had a crush, and of course that was confirmed when she was fighting Neji. At least in my eyes, my interpretation as a reader at that point was when her crush was solidified, and it was undeniable that she had feelings for him. Whether or not that crush would have developed into something more, we didn't know, but I was positive that it would, because of the way things were between them. Naruto's reactions to Hinata, he hasn't had those reactions to anybody else. Because Hinata has had very similar things happen to her, maybe that's why he rooted for her so much during her battle with Neji. Plus, they've both been called failures, and that was something Naruto couldn't stand. He was so angry and hurt. He even said so himself, that he couldn't stand to listen to what Neji was saying. And even though Neji wasn't saying it about him, because he had endured such comments before, and either laughed it off or got into a fight over it. And yes, it hurt him, but he looked upon it as attention, however negative. It was still attention to him. However, before that moment, I don't think we had seen as readers how Naruto would react to someone else calling a person a failure. Even though he'd heard it all before, I suppose maybe it made him angrier that someone else was being called that. Because he could take it, but somebody else may not, because they're not used to it. But of course he wasn't to know that Hinata was used to it, but maybe could not cope with it. And of course that was evident in her expression and how she was close to bursting into tears when Naruto just couldn't take it anymore and shouted out, which in effect stopped what Neji was doing. I'd never seen Naruto so vocal about that before, because I guess up until that point we hadn't met any characters who had suffered the same as him, or at least similarly to him. So that was an interesting thing to note, how Kishimoto had paralleled their suffering, and of course how people reacted to them and what they called them, and with the names they called them. And Naruto's words alone were enough to inspire confidence in Hinata. It was a drastic change from the person who was afraid and hurt to a girl who stopped shaking and no longer had tears in her eyes and had the most resolved expression that she had had ever. So Naruto has had a great impact on Hinata and vice versa. Hinata's fight is very similar to Naruto's fight in the Chunin exams. Both were looking for acknowledgement, and they both received it because everybody in the room was enraptured by their battles. Everybody had their eyes glued to the opponents that they were fighting, and they themselves. Because before that, everybody had thought that Naruto was a failure, that he was a dead last, that he was a loser, and that he was good for nothing. And it was the same for Hinata. Although people most likely thought that, you know, she's a quiet and shy girl who's weird, and more or less what Naruto thought. But probably in the more extreme bit, I suppose because she was so quiet and she was a shrinking violet, that nobody expected her to fight back. And those are some, and this of course links to some of the points that Neji makes during her fight, that she's not fit to be a ninja, she's not battle ready, she's too kind, too gentle, too timid, and doesn't like being in pain and seeing people in pain. Yes, what he said was true. However, a person's nature doesn't, what Neji didn't try and see. Unlike Neji, Naruto looked beyond Hinata's demeanor. He looked beyond that, and he saw how much she was suffering and how much she wanted acknowledgement. Hinata never said anything about being acknowledged, and yet Naruto himself knew what she wanted because he saw himself in her, and vice versa. She saw herself in him. Not just the person she thought she could be, but not just the person she thought she could be, but the fact that they were kindred spirits, that they were going through the same thing. So when Hinata was getting hurt, it seemed that Naruto was one of the few who believed in her, and again vice versa for Hinata when watching Naruto. When everyone else disapproved of him, she approved of what he said. She silently supported him, always, and she was always there as well, watching him. And she had always longed for him to watch her the way she had watched him. And just like how Naruto longed for everybody to watch him the way he had watched them. Because there was no doubt that during his childhood he'd watched people have fun and be happy, and he wanted them to watch him to say that he wanted them to see what he could be as well.